The boat was barely 25 feet long, and the ocean around it stretched out in every direction like it had no end at all. Jose Salvador Alvarenga had fished these waters for years. He knew the currents, the smell of a coming storm, the way the light changed just before the sky turned ugly. But nothing he'd learned in a lifetime at sea prepared him for what was about to happen. In a few hours, he would be swallowed by the Pacific Ocean, and he wouldn't see solid ground again for over a year. This is the true story of a man who was given up for dead, mourned by his own family, and then walked out of the ocean 14 months later, half a world away, barely able to remember his own name. It was November 2012. Alvarenga, a stocky, weathered fisherman in his mid-30s, set out from a small port on the coast of Mexico with a much younger crewmate, a 22-year-old named Ezekiel Cordoba. Ezekiel wasn't even supposed to be on that trip. He'd only just started fishing, still learning the ropes, still calling Alvarenga boss. Neither of them could have known that this routine job, a short run out to catch shark and mahi-mahi, would become the last normal day either of them would ever live. They left the harbor of Costa Azul under a gray sky that didn't look particularly dangerous. Just another day. Just another boat heading out to make a living off a temperamental sea. But somewhere out past the horizon, the weather had other plans. The storm came in fast, the way the worst ones always do. One moment, the water was choppy. The next, it was heaving in walls higher than the boat itself. Rain came down so hard it stung like gravel against exposed skin. The engine, never built for anything like this, sputtered, coughed, and finally gave out completely, leaving them powerless against waves that tossed the small fiberglass hull like a toy in a bathtub. Alvarenga fought the wheel until his arms burned, but there was nothing to steer. No power, no control, just the terrifying realization that the ocean had taken charge, and there was nothing a man could do about it except hold on and pray he'd still be breathing when the sun came up. By the time the storm finally passed, the coastline was gone. Not distant, gone. There was no reference point left in any direction, nothing but water meeting sky in an endless gray ring around them. Their radio was dead. Their navigation equipment was dead. Their engine was dead. All they had left was a boat that could float, a cooler with a few days of ice and fish, and each other. And somewhere back on land, people were already starting to worry. Search boats went out. Planes flew low over the water scanning for any sign of wreckage. Days passed, then weeks, and the search teams began to run out of places to look and reasons to keep looking. Eventually, officials made the call that no family wants to hear. The two men were presumed dead, lost at sea, swallowed up like so many fishermen before them. Funerals were even planned. A woman who loved Alvarenga began to grieve him as a widow grieved the husband. As far as the world was concerned, Jose Salvador Alvarenga no longer existed. But out on the water, far past where any search plane had bothered to check, two men were still alive. Drifting, starving, and utterly, completely alone. The first weeks were the worst kind of waiting. They believed, the way anyone would, that rescue was close. A ship would spot them. A plane would circle back. Someone, somewhere would come. So they rationed the little food they had, sipped water carefully, and scanned the horizon every single hour for a shape that wasn't a wave. No one came. The fish in the cooler ran out first. Then what fresh water they had turned foul in the heat. Alvarenga, who had grown up scraping a living from the sea, understood something his young crewmate didn't yet grasp. The ocean would either kill them slowly, or it would feed them, and there was no middle option. So he did what he'd always done. He fished, using scraps of line, hooks fashioned for whatever metal he could bend, and his bare hands when nothing else worked. Alvarenga caught fish, then turtles, then seabirds that made the mistake of landing on the drifting hull to rest. He taught Ezekiel to eat things raw, things still moving, things that would have made either of them retch back on solid land. Out here, disgust was a luxury neither of them could afford. When rainwater wasn't available, they drank turtle blood. When there was no turtle blood, they went without, watching their bodies shrink and their minds grow slower and heavier with every day the sun rose and set on an ocean that refused to let them go. Weeks turned into months. The boat, never built for open ocean survival, became a kind of prison built entirely of freedom, floating wherever the current decided to take it. There was no rowing your way home from a spot this far out. There was no swimming to safety. There was only drifting, waiting, and trying to stay sane while the mind began playing tricks that felt more real than the boat beneath their feet. Alvarenga would later describe hallucinations so vivid he could no longer tell where reality ended. He spoke to people who weren't there. He argued with voices that existed only inside the slow unraveling of his own exhausted brain. Isolation does something to a person that hunger alone cannot. It empties them out from the inside until the line between what's real and what's imagined simply stops existing. But even in the depths of that unraveling, he never stopped fighting to survive. Every single day, he found a way to eat something. Every single day, he found a way to keep breathing. Ezekiel wasn't so fortunate. Roughly 4 months into the ordeal, the younger man's body began to fail. He'd always struggled more than Alvarenga with the raw diet, with the desperation of eating things still twitching in his hands. His health declined the way a candle burns down, not all at once, but steadily, until there was nothing left to burn. Alvarenga watched his young crewmate grow weaker every day, unable to do anything but offer what comfort he could as a man he'd taken out on a routine fishing trip slipped further and further away from him. When Ezekiel finally died, Alvarenga was left with a decision that no person should ever have to face. Alone on a drifting boat, hundreds, then thousands of miles from anything resembling rescue, he had a body he could not bury and could not simply leave to rot beside him. He kept his crewmate's body on the boat for days, unwilling to let go, unwilling to accept that the person who had shared every terrifying moment of this nightmare with him was now gone. But the ocean does not wait for grief to finish its work. Eventually, Alvarenga was forced to release Ezekiel's body into the sea, watching the water swallow the only other human being he'd had contact with in months. And then there was nothing left but him. Just him, the boat, and an ocean that stretched in every direction with no end anyone could see. From that point forward, Alvarenga was utterly alone. No voice to answer his own. No one to help scan the water for fish. No one to share the terror of a storm rolling in or the strange, hollow relief of another day survived. Just a man talking to himself, to birds, to imagined companions his starving mind conjured up to keep the silence from crushing him completely. He began measuring time by the moon, by the slow rotation of stars he'd once used to help navigate fishing trips that were supposed to last a single day. Weeks became unrecognizable from each other. The boat, its paint stripped by sun and salt, became a kind of second skin, and he a creature shaped entirely by hunger, thirst, and the relentless will to see one more sunrise. His body deteriorated in ways that would shock doctors months later. His hair grew long and matted. His skin blistered, healed, and blistered again under a sun with no mercy. His muscles wasted from a diet that could never provide enough to sustain a body, doing everything it could simply to stay alive. And still, somehow, day after day, he kept surviving. Alvarenga would later describe long stretches where he considered giving up entirely, where the exhaustion of fighting to live became heavier than the fear of dying. But something in him refused to let go completely. Maybe it was the woman waiting for him back home, the one who didn't yet know she was mourning a man who was still, impossibly, breathing. Maybe it was pure stubbornness, the same trait that had made him a fisherman in the first place. Whatever it was, it kept him reaching for another fish, another gulp of rainwater, another day. The boat carried him across thousands of miles of open Pacific, propelled by currents no map could have predicted. He had no way of knowing it, but his tiny, battered vessel was slowly making its way clear across one of the largest bodies of water on the planet, drifting from the coast of Mexico all the way toward the islands of the Western Pacific. Think about that distance for a moment. Not a boat with an engine. Not a boat with sails set by a crew who knew where they were going. Just a broken hull and a man barely clinging to life, carried by nothing but wind and current, across a stretch of ocean that could swallow entire fleets without a trace. Months kept passing. His hope, which had once burned so bright in those first desperate weeks, dimmed into something quieter, something closer to acceptance than expectation. He stopped scanning the horizon for ships the way he once had. He simply survived 1 hour at a time, because that was the only thing left to do. And then, after 438 days lost at sea, something changed. It started with birds. More of them than he'd seen and longer than he could remember, circling, calling, behaving the way birds do when land is close. Then came the smell, faint at first, then unmistakable. Vegetation. Earth. Something that wasn't salt and rot and endless water. Land. Alvarenga spotted the shape of an island rising up out of the horizon, and for a moment his exhausted mind refused to believe it, certain this was just one more hallucination sent to torment him the way so many others had before. But this one didn't fade. This one grew larger, clearer, more solid with every passing hour as the current. The same current that had carried him across an entire ocean, pushed his broken little boat toward the shore of Ebon Atoll in the Marshall Islands. He staggered onto the beach, barely able to stand, his body a shell of the man who'd left port in Mexico over a year earlier. His hair hung past his shoulders in filthy tangles. His skin was cracked and sun-scarred. He looked less like a fisherman and more like a castaway pulled straight out of a nightmare no one else could imagine surviving. Local residents who found him on the shore were stunned into silence, unsure at first if what they were looking at was even human. When word of his survival reached the outside world, it spread like wildfire. A man, lost at sea for over 14 months, presumed dead by his own family, had washed up alive on a remote Pacific island nearly 6,000 miles from where his journey began. Doctors who examined him afterward could barely believe the physical toll his body had endured, and yet somehow, against odds that seemed almost mathematically impossible, he had lived. His account of the ordeal, the storm, the death of his young companion, the raw survival diet of turtles and birds and rainwater, the slow unraveling of his own mind under the crushing weight of isolation, was met initially with disbelief from some corners of the world. How could anyone survive that long, drifting that far, completely alone? Skepticism followed him almost as relentlessly as the ocean once had. But investigators, scientists, and oceanographers who studied ocean currents in that region eventually confirmed what seemed impossible. The drift patterns, the timeline, the physical state of his body and boat, all of it lined up with a survival story so extreme it read more like fiction than fact. The man who had been mourned as dead really had spent over 400 days lost in open ocean, and really had lived to tell the story of every single one of them. When Alvarenga finally returned home to El Salvador, the reunion with his family was something that words can barely capture. People who had buried him in their hearts, who had grieved him at a funeral held in his absence, stood face to face with a man they thought they would never see again. His daughter, who had grown up believing her father was gone, was suddenly staring at the impossible truth that he wasn't. But return didn't mean the ordeal was truly over. The physical scars healed in time, but what lingered longer, what always lingers longer after something like this, was the weight of everything his mind had been forced to carry. The isolation, the hallucinations, the death of a young man who had trusted him, who had followed him out onto a boat that should have brought them both home in a matter of hours instead of over a year later. Alvarenga's story became one of the most studied survival cases of its kind, a real-world test of just how far the human body and mind can be pushed before they finally break, and remarkably, how far they can be pushed without breaking at all. Researchers pointed to his fishing background, his resourcefulness, and above all, his refusal to give in to the kind of despair that kills faster than hunger ever could. There's something almost impossible to reconcile about a story like this. A man vanishes into a storm. The world declares him dead. And then, 14 months later, the ocean simply gives him back, changed forever, but alive. It raises a question that's hard to shake once you've heard the details. How much can a person actually endure when survival is the only option left? Alvarenga never set out to test the limits of human endurance. He just wanted to bring in a catch and get home for dinner. Instead, the sea decided to test him in ways almost no one else in recorded history has ever faced and lived to describe. His story stands now as one of the most extraordinary survival accounts of modern times, a reminder of how much the human body can withstand when the will behind it simply refuses to quit. 438 days, thousands of miles of open Pacific, one man, in an ocean that, in the end, couldn't finish what it started.